All right. What's up, guys? Hope you're doing well. James here from jamesdforsythe.com. So, going over a recent speech by Fed Governor Christopher Waller, and I didn't know this about him for one, and for two, it kind of, the speech itself is him kind of giving his economic outlook for the next few years, right? And kind of being very data dependent as they always are, and really talking about inflation and that sort of thing. But the speech was given at the annual Vienna Macroeconomics Workshop in Vienna, Austria, right? And the first few words are "Thank you, Klaus," which I could only assume, it being in Austria, is the Klauster himself of Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum, right? But I'm going to go straight into the screen share for the speech itself, just so you guys can see the words yourself as well. And so basically, I didn't realize how in tune Governor Waller was in that respect with, I'll say, I guess, the World Economic Forum, but or at least this macroeconomic workshop that seems to be very to run parallel to what they have as their agenda per se. At least that's what it seems to be. With Waller saying himself that he's a supporter and he guesses a practitioner of rigorous criticism because, and just quoting him directly, as you may have heard, the conference award given each year for outstanding critic was named for me, being Waller. Based on the standard he set, the person who wins the award is also known as the most annoying participant, which I mean, I can understand that. Um, not calling him annoying or anything, but just like why someone who would be known as the outstanding critic could also be known as the most annoying participant, depending on the degree of criticism that they give, or I guess it's all contextual. But regardless, he was giving the speech basically as a giving his outlook of the U.S. economy and the Federal Reserve's ongoing campaign to bring down inflation. Right. So he had three major takeaways. The first is inflation is far too high, and it is too soon to say whether inflation is moving meaningfully and persistently downward. All right. So have we actually seen a, I guess, global top in inflation, at least relatively, obviously, but and not just kind of like a short-term local top, right? Are we going to be more in a disinflationary period until basically it tapers down to 2%? We're good, back to normal, whatever, or is it basically, are we in a period of secular inflation, right? And it's just going to basically, this is just a short term top and it's going right back up, right? And that kind of depends on what you believe your are the main causes for it, right? And so the second takeaway is that the fears of recession starting in the first half of this year have faded away, and the robust U.S. labor market is giving us the flexibility to be aggressive in our fight against inflation, right? Labor market's always robust, right? And so the final takeaway is that I believe, being Waller, um, forward guidance is becoming less useful at this stage in the tightening cycle. And a lot of that too is it's arguable whether or not the Fed basically not accurately, I don't want to say accurately, that's not the best word for it, but it's almost like whenever with the rate hikes, where there's kind of a changing of whether or not they're saying it's data dependent. And then is it going to be 75 basis points? Is it going to be 100? Is it going to be 50? And so, kind of with that discrepancy or kind of small surprises, is the Fed kind of losing credibility in that respect to where forward guidance is no longer a useful tool, right? Which is something to keep in mind because pretty much the only tool they had to a significant degree for the past few decades, I guess couple, no, a decade or so, you get the point, right? And so what I mean by that, right, is that I forget who's quoted saying it, but it's like one of the Fed governors, I think it was the chairman, and I forget which one, basically said that monetary policy is like 90% talk, right? And if you think about it with Fed funds, it's not really, that's just one interest rate, right? And it seems like in the grand scheme of things, people give the Fed a lot more, think the Fed has a lot more power than they actually do, right? We'll leave it at that. So inflation is widespread, continuing on with the speech, driven by strong demand that has only begun to moderate by an ongoing lag in labor force participation and by supply chain problems that may be improving in some areas but are still considerable. For these reasons, he expects it will take some time before inflation moves back to their 2% goal and that the FOMC will be tightening policy into 2023, right? And so they expect tightening monetary policy for at least, I'll say, 6 months or so to get you past the first quarter of 2023, at least. Um, there's obviously they're not giving an exact date, right? So there's that. Expect policy tightening for a while, and especially with inflation this high, it's kind of like whatever collateral damage is necessary. It seems like it's going to be taken, right? And so with each passing week, back on the recession part, um, kind of moving away from inflation within his speech. So with each passing week, the absence of any indication of a recession and spending or employment data buries that recession argument a little deeper. We understand some of the factors that lowered the GDP numbers in the first half, and debate continues about whether other possible factors such as mismeasurement potentially underreporting GDP, right? So my thing is it seems he's basically quoting nominal GDP, because the numbers are a little bit different too. And it says the Atlanta Fed's GDP now model forecasts real GDP, where they're switching to real, will grow 2.6% this quarter, though other estimates are a touch below this prediction, right? And that's one of those things, especially on the recessionary talk. It's like I've seen some argument about like they're just changing definitions and that sort of thing to where it's basically like the first two quarters had negative real GDP growth, and so it's not that's a contraction, right? It's not just like a slowing. That's full on contraction in GDP. But anyways, that the whole point of this isn't to get down that kind of argument, I guess, after there may or may not be a specific video on that, kind of looking more into it further, but exploring different arguments. But regardless, so forward looking indicators of manufacturing activity, such as new orders indexes in various manufacturing surveys, are softer than earlier in the year, but most, and in particular, the positive August reading for the ISM, are not suggestive of a material pullback in manufacturing activity. Meanwhile, the non-manufacturing ISM report suggests continuing growth, which is with its new orders index rising to a solid level last month. Right. Whenever we start to get into specific indices and stuff, I tend not to comment unless I know exactly how they're calculated. With these two, I don't. And so I'm not going to make a specific comment on it because that's one thing I've noticed when looking into the different indices and measurements and all these forward looking indicators or whatever. Um, is you really have to pay attention to how exactly they're measured. You can't just look at the name of the indicator and assume how it's measured because a lot of the times what you would think is common sense of how it should be measured isn't how it's measured at all or calculated depending on what it is, right? So that's something to keep in mind. So the inventory of unsold new, getting into real estate. The inventory of unsold new and existing homes has more than doubled since January, while the 3 month supply of existing homes is still below levels before the pandemic. The 11 months of new home inventory is the highest since the spring of 2009, right? So kind of an ominous date with respect to the housing market. Um, and there's been some argument of whether or not this is like a real estate crash or whatever, and not the purpose of this video. There's a lot of data that needs to be done or needs to be brought to light, we'll say, and have it like on screen in front showing sort of thing for it to really be helpful. But either way, it's one of those things you really have to look at the grand scheme of inventories, and someone who, especially when you're talking about single family housing, look up Jason Hartman because he's got a lot of stuff on that, and especially with inventory numbers, he's a great person to listen to and look up to in that respect, right? So the FOMC's goal is that tightening the monetary policy slows aggregate demand so that it is in better alignment with supply across all sectors of the economy. This is something I've talked about in a few previous videos to where I mean the FOMC and the Federal Reserve in general, I mean monetary policy, you just can't do anything with supply really. Like they can't print oil, they can't print goods and services, that kind of stuff. You could argue that they could basically try to stimulate demand with that Keynesian approach, which, as they've tried to do for quite some time. But ultimately, when it comes to tightening monetary policy, all they can really do is attack demand in a way to try to kind of bring it down to get that supply demand imbalance or to fix that supply demand imbalance, right? In kind of this next statement, he's talking a little bit about offsetting tighter policy, and then it'll support a slowing rather than contraction in demand. And to be completely honest, I'm not really sure how exactly what nuance is there to that distinction between slowing and contraction in demand, because it seems like demand's kind of like how much people need to buy, right, or want to buy whatever. And so a slowing in that amount kind of just seems like a contraction in general. Is it slower growth or what? Um, that's what I'd assume he means, but again, I don't know. It's worth to raise the question, right? And kind of moving on to the labor market in a way. So job openings have started to decline a bit, but remain very elevated. This data confirms that the Fed is hitting its full employment mandate. So basically, all the attention can be put to bringing inflation down because remember they have a dual mandate that's mandated by Congress, right? And so basically, the whole full employment and then price stability, right? Which is kind of inflation in general, which for some reason is a positive inflation rate. It's not an actual like stable price. You as you'd assume, there has to be apparently some intrinsic growth, quote unquote, of that price over time for it to be quote unquote stable, right? Again, and it's one of those things too with job openings. There's a lot that goes into it, and that's not really the point of the speech to go down that rabbit hole specifically, right? So back onto inflation. Inflation slowed in July, which was a very encouraging development. Headline inflation for both the Consumer Price Index and the index derived from personal consumption expenditures, PCE, which remember, PCE is the Fed's preferred measure. Seems like both slowed, largely due to continuing declines in prices for gasoline and other petroleum products. Excluding volatile energy and food prices, they always have to put volatile with that. Like it always, it's almost like it's kind of trying to de-emphasize the use of that stuff, right? Energy and food. But that's like the vast majority, like a that's not a variable cost for people really. Like you have to have food and energy. You have to have housing, right? And so it's like they always call it like volatile, and they'll even like separate it. So like in the next statement, you have core inflation, which is X food and energy, but that's like everyone has to have it. You just whatever. It's one of those things. It's like is it kind of it's a play on the data. It seems right to basically get a certain narrative isn't really a word, or it isn't really the right word for it. But still, I hope you get my point. So core inflation for these two indexes also stepped down from the rapid increases of earlier this year, but it is still too early to say that inflation is moving meaningfully and persistently downward. Again, local top or not, but it's still like in the next sentence. Inflation is still widespread for both headline and core inflation. At least 60% of the underlying categories of different goods and services increased by 3% or more. Right, so well over half. Right, but whatever. You really have to look into like this is part of the reason with like the CPI and the PCE, and that's one of the reasons why I brought up. Do you really have to look at how exactly things are measured? Like look into the nuances between like owner's equivalent rent and actual rents and say like actual housing data, how much people actually paying for it, not just kind of doing it through surveys, right? And then looking into like how the CPI itself is calculated. I forget the exact numbers, but I wrote a blog post 6 maybe 8 months ago, somewhere in there, quite some time ago, about basically going more in depth on the CPI and what exactly like how exactly it was measured, like the CPIU, where it's pretty much just like and there's like 75 urban areas or something like that, and it was very specific, like specific areas, with specific proportions of people, and asked specific. They basically surveyed specific things, saying like how much their prices increased, whether it was like businesses or even some households, if I remember correctly. Um, Things like that. Like you really have to look into how exactly these things are measured, and it's really puts it in perspective. But regardless, in a speech in March, he noted based on various measures of asking rents, some analysts were predicting that the rate of rent inflation in the consumer price index could double in 2022, and so far it is on pace to more than double. Owner's equivalent rent is similarly on pace to nearly double this year. So notice that the actual, it seems, asking rents, which seems like it's what landlords are actually asking for. So maybe this is like actual data, you know, of the actual market and stuff, is on pace to more than double, but owner's equivalent rent is only to nearly double this year. Now it might just be changing a little bit of diction to make it flow better or whatever, just natural speaking, but also it's like they put a lot of emphasis on like the exact words they state, and I know that's more applicable to like the FOMC statement, but still, um, owner's equivalent rent is probably going to be significantly less than the actual asking rents in general, which should raise an eyebrow, at least I think. So, onto wages a little bit. So, nominal wages have been growing quickly. The Atlanta Fed's wage growth tracker hit another record in July for its 24 years of data, a 12-month rate of 6.7% wage growth. Keep in mind, this is nominal wages because they're not going to talk about real wages when inflation is north of 8%, right? Especially when they even state that it's 6.7% for their wage growth, right? Keep in mind both nominal prices. So, and he starts talking about like quitting rates. And so, kind of showing as and I listened to a podcast. I think it was Eurodollar University where they talked a little bit about this on like how I may be completely wrong on that on which podcast it was. So I listened to quite a few as I was traveling this weekend or yesterday. So keep that in mind. But so quitting rates are kind of a way to like people will quit their job to move to a different one to basically because it's easier sometimes to change jobs to increase your wage rather than just ask for a raise, right? There's a little bit more, I guess, leverage that's weighed towards the employee in that kind of situation. And so you can use quitting rates as a kind of a proxy for that, for how wage growth is doing. So quits are near their highest level in over 22 years that the government has tracked them, but they have come down from the start of this year, and further decreases would bring them closer to the level that they were immediately before the pandemic, when wages were growing much more slowly than today, right? So kind of maybe wages are going to start coming down too. And I guess maybe that could be an argument for hopefully inflation following, but not necessarily. Again, is it more of a supply shock inflation or secular, right? So, as inflation moved higher over the past year and a half, measures of short term inflation expectations moved up notably, but measures of longer term expectations rose only a little and generally stand near levels seen in the years before the pandemic when inflation was low, right? And so it's kind of like this is where they pay a lot of attention to inflation expectations because that's really what can cause the difference between like what we have now with like 8-9% inflation and like 17-20% that you would see in specific spikes in say I believe it was the 1940s had some, and then kind of a more secular inflation like the 1970s, right? Kind of that stagflationary environment, right? We had like the whole wage price spiral and that sort of thing. um, and so they really want to keep long, especially longer term expectations low because that kind of shows, and he even says the public retains confidence that the Fed will be able to rein in inflation in the medium term. So in the next year, year and a half, I'd assume, kind of being consistent with what he's saying. So those earlier inflation readings probably delayed their pivot. They're talking about how kind of inflation was high and then it seemed like it kind of peaked a little bit. And basically, they may have delayed their tightening by a few months. And then he says the consequences of being fooled by temporary softening in inflation could be even greater now if another misjudgment damages the Fed's credibility. So until they see a meaningful and persistent moderation of the rise in core prices, they'll support taking significant further steps to tighten monetary policy. So they really don't want to take a misstep in the direction of easing. They'd rather just keep tightening. And even if it is an actual peak, it keeps coming down. They want to be extremely sure that that's what's happening before they let up. Kind of giving credence to the whole argument, like this is for real. There is no Fed pivot coming in a way. At least it's giving credence to that argument. So the policy rate will have to move meaningfully above the neutral level to further restrain aggregate demand and put more downward pressure on prices, right? They really don't want to take chances with this. And this is really, really reflected in his final statement of the whole speech, saying the pace of tightening is uncertain. It'll depend on data, as they always say. No matter what, he's ready and willing to do what it takes to bring inflation down. So, kind of more of hawkish speak, per se, right? And this speech was given on September 9th, 2022. So, stop the screen share. As always, I'll put a link in the description so you guys can read the speech yourself. I believe this one also has one where you can watch it. Maybe not. Some of them do, some of them don't. This one has a share button, but it doesn't. A lot of them will have like a watch live or whatever, or where you can go and watch the actual speech given. I don't see that link on this one specifically, but maybe you'll be able to find it if you'd prefer to watch it. I just prefer to read them. But, anyways, with that being said, I'm gonna let this one go. So I hope you guys have a good night, and I will see you on the next one.